Okay, so we have our event pattern basically working, but I mentioned that we could do it a little simpler. So the step that we can skip going forward is this one, the creating the delegate. And the reason is that C# has a built-in essentially has a built-in delegate type that we can use for simple stuff. There's two that are really common. There's the action and then there's the func. And basically it has to do with whether or not your method that you want to use as a delegate is going to have a void return type or it's going to return some actual data. So actions have void return types and funcs have actual data that they're returning. So if you go to the Microsoft documentation, you can see, func and action are parts of the .NET API that's basically just built into C#. And you can see that an action encapsulates a method that has a single parameter. Actually, here, this is what we meant to click. An action encapsulates a method that has no parameters and does not return a value, whereas a func has no parameters and returns a value of the type specified. So funcs have a return type and actions do not. So in this case, we're dealing with an action, which is kind of why we named it action to begin with. So what we can do to simplify life is just not ever make a delegate, pretty much, and instead of saying that this event is of some special fancy delegate type, we can just say it's an action. And you'll notice that by default, we get a little issue because action isn't included without a special namespace. So I'm just going to hit Control period, which is the hotkey for the quick fixes or whatever. And you can see that we're just missing a using statement here. So if I add using system, all of a sudden it understands what an action is, and so we can totally skip the whole delegate part of this setup. And instead we just say this is an event that doesn't need a return type, so it's an action. So that's the way to simplify things, but there's still a problem here. What if we ever want to have a method or a contextual message it doesn't say testing? Right now, every time you run into any of these triggers, no matter how many and different types we make, it's always just going to say testing for 2 seconds. And that's not desirable. So we wanted to be able to warn people about the ice or warn them that they're not going to be able to respawn if they fall off and all kinds of different things. So we need to make our setup a little bit more robust. What I think that we should do is, rather than hard coding these parameters here, we need to change it so that our event handler actually includes parameters that we can pass in to the show message method here. So the way to do that is, instead of just a regular action, we can make an action with some included parameters. So the way you do that, the syntax is you add a little angle bracket and then you put in the type of parameters that you need. So in our case, we need a string and then we need a float. So it would be action string, float. There we go. And this is covered in the documentation like I just showed you. You can see that you can make actions with up to 16 parameters, I guess, which is kind of nuts. At that point, I would maybe make a special delegate for it, because who's going to remember what all 16 of those parameters are for? But anyway, it's supported. Probably rare you're going to get more than 2 or 3 parameters, but just in case. And it's the same thing with funcs. So if you needed a return type, you can still have funcs with all kinds of different parameters. All right, So now you'll see that since we changed the type of action that fits into this event, this isn't working anymore. And so the reason it's not working is because we've decided that this action that fits into this event has to have parameters, has to have a string and a float parameter. And right now we're calling invoke with no parameters. So what are the parameters that we want to pass in? Well, those parameters should be defined by the designer so that the designer can make all kinds of different triggers, all kinds of different instances of triggers that do different things. So we're going to create some serialized fields for these. So let's go up to top of our class and make some serialized fields. So we need one serialized field for the message. So we'll say private string message. And I guess we could give it a default, like, I don't know. Maybe that's not helpful. I'm not sure. It's just something the user's going to have to delete every time, but it's probably better than not having anything. So that if you forget, maybe we should say something like default message. Anyway, then we need another serialized field for the duration. So that's a float. Yeah, I'm trying to decide if we want to call it message duration. That's probably a little better. And let's give that a default too. We can be all formal about it. All right. And now when we call invoke over here, we know what data we want to supply. And that's going to be the message and the duration in that order because our event requires a string and then a float. So it'll be message and then message duration. Oops. So that should take care of a lot. Let's go ahead and save this. But the problem is, if we go back over to our contextual message controller, our event handler is now going to be causing problems because the method that we're trying to store in this event no longer fits. So you can remember this thing now needs an action that has a string and a float parameter, and we're trying to squeeze into that something that has no parameters. So it would be like trying to store a string in a float variable. It just doesn't fit. It won't work. So we have to change our event handler to include parameters. So it needs a string message and a float message duration. And when you call it, we don't want to pass in this hard-coded stuff, the magic string and the magic number. So we're finally fixing that problem. Instead, we will pass in these named variables so it's very clear what's happening. So not only is it more clear, but it's also way more flexible. So we can now use this single instance of, or the single script. I guess there's two scripts, but we can create all kinds of different messages with just these two scripts instead of having to write special ones for every different message we might want to put on the screen. So let's save this stuff and let's go to Unity. If we click on our trigger, we're going to have those new serialized fields that we have to deal with. So we have the default message and the duration. Why don't I just duplicate this with Control D and make sure I'm in object mode so I don't change the shape of this guy. And in this one, let's put a different message so we can make sure that's working. And we'll make this one last like 5 seconds, so it's a little longer. We can test the difference between a 1 second and a 5 second. Why don't we just change this so it says longer message duration. All right, so if we run the game now, the one on the right should go away in 1 second. The one on the left should take longer. All right, seems like it's working. Now, I guess, yeah, that's a good stopping point for this video, I think. So let me go ahead and stop it, but we need to make sure we make our commits, right? So let's see what happened here. Well, let me save again. I forgot to save my scene. Okay. So we added a second trigger, and we refactored our code to use an action and parameters. All right, so let's commit that and push. And I think we can make one more video. So this basically covered the event pattern or the observer pattern and events, but I want to make one more video to kind of make this functionality a little bit better. Not, it'll have nothing to do with events, but just right now the way we're changing our text is kind of not very glamorous. We're just totally turning it off after a certain amount of time. So we can soup up our code routine a little bit here and figure out what happens. Like, we're going to have a little bit of a bug if you were to like run into these over and over. It's going to probably give us weird behavior, but we'll look at that in the next video.